Naomi never expected anyone to read the letters she left at her husband's grave, until one Sunday, a stranger writes back. His words echo her pain, but he's hiding a truth that could shatter everything. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Tessa Bloom stood in front of the bathroom mirror in her tiny apartment, trying to ignore the dark circles under her eyes. 28 years old, and she felt like she was carrying the weight of the world. The eviction notice on her kitchen counter gave her exactly 2 weeks to find a new place to live. The non-profit where she'd worked for 5 years had closed without warning last month, leaving her scrambling for jobs in a market that seemed determined to ignore her applications. One day at a time, she told her reflection. The same words her grandmother used to say before she passed away 3 years ago. Now, with no family to fall back on, those words had become Tessa's daily mantra. She grabbed her phone and pulled up the real estate app she'd been obsessively checking. She couldn't afford any of the listings, but there was something calming about walking through open houses, pretending for just an hour that her life wasn't falling apart. Today, there was a new listing that caught her eye, an estate in upstate New York, about an hour's drive from her apartment. Why not, she whispered, grabbing her keys. At least the drive would give her time to think. The GPS led her down winding roads lined with trees, showing the first hints of spring. The farther she drove from the city, the lighter her chest felt. When she finally turned onto a private drive, her breath caught in her throat. The house was stunning, not ostentatious like she'd expected, but warm and inviting, tucked away in a clearing surrounded by woods. Tessa parked her beat-up Honda next to a sign that read "Open House" and checked her reflection in the rear view mirror. Her brown hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and her simple blue dress was wrinkled from the drive. She didn't look like someone who could afford this place, but that wasn't the point. She just needed an hour of pretending. As she approached the front door, she noticed it was slightly ajar. She knocked gently, but no one answered. "Hello? Anyone here?" she called out, poking her head inside. The interior was even more beautiful than she'd imagined. Sunlight streamed through large windows, highlighting warm wooden floors and comfortable, elegant furniture. It wasn't the cold showcase she'd expected from an expensive home. It felt lived in, or at least meant to be. "Lived in? Must be running late," she murmured, assuming the realtor was on their way. Since the door was open, she decided to look around while she waited. Out of respect, she slipped off her shoes at the entrance, leaving them neatly by the door. Her bare feet made no sound as she wandered from room to room, taking in the kitchen. With its large island, the living room with bookshelves built into the walls, the dining room that overlooked a garden just starting to bloom. Each room felt more right than the last, as if whoever designed this place had somehow known exactly what she would have wanted in a home, if she could ever afford one. It wasn't just the architecture or the furnishings. There was something about the way the light fell, the way the rooms connected to each other, that made her feel at peace for the first time in weeks. Eventually, she found herself at the top of a staircase. The second floor was just as inviting as the first. She wandered down a hallway, peeking into bedrooms and bathrooms, until she reached what was clearly the master suite. The room was spacious but not overwhelming, with large windows overlooking the woods behind the house. A king-sized bed dominated one wall, made up with crisp white sheets folded so perfectly they looked untouched. Across from it sat a velvet chair in the exact spot where sunlight pooled on the floor. Tessa stood in the doorway, mesmerized by the scene. Without thinking, she walked to the chair and sat down, letting the warmth of the sun wash over her. The exhaustion of the past few weeks suddenly hit her all at once. Her eyes grew heavy as she watched dust motes dance in the sunbeams. She glanced at the bed, so perfectly made, so inviting. She hadn't been sleeping well lately, tossing and turning with worry about money, about finding a new job, about where she would go when her lease ended. "Just for a minute," she whispered to herself, moving from the chair to perch on the edge of the bed. The mattress was firm but comfortable, yielding just enough as she lay down on top of the covers. She told herself she would rest her eyes for just a moment, then continue her tour. For the first time in days, Tessa Bloom slept. Beckett Rowe wasn't in the mood to deal with potential buyers. At 32, he'd already achieved more than most people did in a lifetime. As the founder and CEO of Row Designs, one of the most sought-after architectural firms in the country, he had more money than he knew what to do with. But success had come with a price he never wanted to pay. "I still think this is a mistake," his assistant said over the phone as Beckett drove toward the estate. "You built that house yourself. It's your masterpiece." "It's just a house, Claire," he replied, though they both knew it was a lie. "I can't live there. Might as well let someone else enjoy it." He ended the call as he turned onto the private drive that led to the property he'd poured his heart and soul into for 3 years. The house had been his dream, their dream, a place where he and Eliza would build a life together. But Eliza had never seen the finished product. Cancer had taken her 6 months before completion, and now the house stood as a monument to everything he'd lost. Beckett frowned when he saw an unfamiliar car parked next to the realtor's sign. He checked his watch. He was supposed to have an hour alone in the house before the open house started. That's why he'd arranged to meet the realtor later. He needed time to say goodbye to the place properly. He parked behind the other car and walked to the front door, irritated to find it open. Someone had arrived early, and his precious hour of solitude was ruined. He stepped inside, ready to ask whoever it was to come back later, when he noticed a pair of women's flats by the door, neatly placed side by side. His irritation softened slightly at this small sign of respect. He walked through the first floor, listening for voices, but the house was silent. Had the visitor already left? But then why were the shoes still here? He climbed the stairs, checking each room as he went. When he reached the master bedroom, he stopped in the doorway, caught off guard by what he saw. A young woman was asleep on the bed. She lay curled on her side on top of the covers, her face peaceful in repose. She was small, dressed simply in a blue dress that had ridden up slightly, to reveal a bruise on her knee. Her hair had come partly loose from its bun, framing a face that looked exhausted even in sleep. Beckett's first instinct was to wake her, to demand what she was doing in his house. But something stopped him. There was something about the way she fit into the scene. The sunlight from the windows illuminating her form, the gentle rise and fall of her chest, the way her hand curled slightly on the pillow. For a split second, it was like seeing the house as it was meant to be, not empty and perfect, but lived in, a sanctuary for someone who needed rest. Instead of waking her, he quietly moved to the velvet chair by the window and sat down. He would wait. He could give her this moment of peace at least. As he watched her sleep, Beckett found himself wondering who she was and what had brought her here. She didn't look like his usual potential buyers, wealthy couples or single professionals with more money than taste. There was something unpretentious about her, something genuine that resonated with the spirit in which he designed this house. After about 20 minutes, she stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, disoriented at first, then widening with shock as she realized where she was. She bolted upright, her gaze darting around the room until it landed on him sitting in the corner. "Oh my God," she gasped, scrambling to her feet. "I'm so sorry. I don't know what... I didn't mean to..." "Oh, you look tired," Beckett said quietly, his voice gentler than he'd intended. "I couldn't take that from you." Her face flushed deep red. "This is so embarrassing. I was just looking around. I thought the realtor was coming and..." "Wait, are you the realtor?" "I'm the owner," he replied, standing up. "Beckett Row." Her blush deepened. "I'm Tessa Bloom. I am mortified right now. I've never done anything like this before. I was just..." She trailed off, looking around the room as if seeing it for the first time. "Your house is beautiful. It feels like..." "Like what?" He found himself asking, curious despite himself. She met his eyes briefly, then looked away. "Like somewhere you'd want to stay forever," she admitted. "I should go. I'm so sorry for the intrusion." Before he could respond, she hurried past him and down the hallway. He followed at a distance, watching as she practically ran down the stairs. At the front door, she hastily slipped on her shoes, fumbling with the straps in her rush. "Miss Bloom," he called, but she was already out the door. Through the window, he watched her get into her car and drive away, her face still flushed with embarrassment. Beckett stood in the entryway, surprisingly affected by the brief encounter. There had been something arresting about finding her there, something that had momentarily made the house feel like the home it was meant to be, rather than the beautiful shell it had become. He pulled out his phone and called his realtor. "Nancy, that woman who was just here, Tessa Bloom. Find out who she is." "Was there a problem?" Nancy asked, concerned. Beckett looked around at the perfect empty house that had never felt so alive as when a stranger had fallen asleep in it. "No," he said slowly. "No problem. Just give her a reason to come back." He ended the call and walked back upstairs to the master bedroom. The indentation where Tessa had lain was still visible on the bedspread. He sat on the edge of the bed, in the same spot where she had sat, and for the first time since Eliza died, he looked around the room and thought not of what could have been, but of what might still be. "You're already home," he whispered to the empty room, echoing words he hadn't realized he'd thought until they were spoken aloud. Tessa drove away from the estate as fast as she legally could, her heart hammering in her chest. Of all the embarrassing things she'd done in her life, and there had been plenty, falling asleep in a stranger's bed during an open house had to top the list, and not just any stranger. Beckett Rowe. Even in her flustered state, the name had registered. She'd seen it in architecture magazines at the non-profit where she'd worked. He was famous for his innovative designs, for creating spaces that weren't just beautiful, but meaningful. And she had drooled on his pillow. "He probably thinks I'm homeless," she groaned, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "Or crazy, or both." By the time she reached her apartment, her embarrassment had given way to a strange sort of melancholy. For a brief moment, lying in that perfect bed in that perfect house, she had felt something she hadn't felt in years, safe. And now she was back in her tiny apartment, with its eviction notice and stack of rejection letters. Reality crashed back around her as she checked her email. Another form rejection for a job she'd been hopeful about. She closed her laptop and crawled into her own bed, so different from the one she'd napped in earlier. As she drifted off to sleep, her last thought was of sunlight streaming through windows and the quiet voice of a man saying, "I couldn't take that from you." The next morning, Tessa woke to the sound of her phone chiming with a new email. Half asleep, she grabbed it from her nightstand and squinted at the screen. The subject line jolted her fully awake. Job opportunity, private archivist for Rowe. Designs. Her finger hovered over the delete button, sure it was spam. But curiosity won out, and she opened the email. "Dear Ms. Bloom," it read. "Following a recommendation, we would like to offer you a position as private archivist for Rowe Designs. The role involves organizing and digitizing our historical blueprints, correspondence, and design materials. Your background in non-profit administration suggests you have the organizational skills we require. The position offers competitive salary and benefits. Please reply to schedule an interview at your earliest convenience." It was signed by Claire Donovan, executive assistant to Beckett Rowe. Tessa stared at the email in disbelief. How did they know where she worked? How did they even know her email address? It had to be a coincidence. There must be another Tessa Bloom out there with a background in non-profit administration, but the timing was too perfect. This had to be connected to yesterday's mortifying encounter. She read the email again, noting the mention of a recommendation. Had Beckett Rowe, finding her asleep in his house, somehow decided she was qualified to archive his company's materials? It made no sense. Unless it was pity. The thought made her stomach turn. She didn't want charity, especially not from a billionaire architect who had caught her at her lowest moment. Her finger hovered over the delete button again, but then her eyes drifted to the stack of bills on her desk, to the eviction notice she'd pinned to her bulletin board, as if seeing it every day would somehow make a solution appear. Pride wouldn't pay her rent. Pride wouldn't find her a new place to live. With a deep breath, Tessa hit reply and typed a simple message. "Thank you for the opportunity. I'm available for an interview at your convenience." She hit send before she could change her mind, then fell back against her pillows, wondering if she had just made the best decision of her life, or the worst. Tessa tugged nervously at the hem of her dress as she stood outside the gleaming glass building that housed Rowe Designs. The interview had been scheduled for 10 in the morning, and she'd arrived 30 minutes early, too anxious to wait in her apartment. "You can do this," she whispered to herself, before pushing through the revolving door into a lobby that seemed designed to intimidate. Everything was sleek lines and polished surfaces, with a massive reception desk made of what looked like a single slab of marble. The receptionist looked up with a practiced smile. "Welcome to Row Designs. How may I help?" "You? I'm Tessa Bloom. I have an interview at 10. The woman's smile warmed slightly. "Of course, Ms. Bloom. Ms. Donovan is expecting you. Take the elevator to the 12th floor." The elevator moved so smoothly that Tessa barely felt it ascending. When the doors opened, she was greeted by a woman with short grey hair and sharp eyes who extended her hand immediately. "Ms. Bloom, I'm Claire Donovan. Thank you for coming in on such short notice." Tessa shook her hand, surprised by the firm grip. "Thank you for the opportunity, Ms. Donovan. Call me Claire, please. Come with me." As they walked down a hallway lined with framed architectural drawings, Tessa gathered her courage. "May I ask, how did you find me? I mean, how did you know about my background?" Claire's lips quirked in a small smile. "Mr. Rowe has his ways. He was quite insistent about offering you this position." Before Tessa could process that, Claire opened a door to a conference room where, to Tessa's surprise, Beckett Rowe himself sat waiting. He wore a simple blue button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing strong forearms. His dark hair was slightly messy, as if he'd run his hands through it repeatedly. "Ms. Bloom," he said, standing as they entered. "Thank you for coming." Tessa felt her cheeks warm at the memory of their last encounter. "Mr. Rowe, thank you for this opportunity, though I'm still not sure why you're offering it to me." Claire excused herself, closing the door behind her. "Please sit." Beckett gestured to a chair across from him. "Would you like coffee, water?" "Water, please." As he poured her a glass from a pitcher on the table, Tessa took the opportunity to study him. In the daylight, away from the strange intimacy of finding her asleep in his home, he looked more like the successful businessman he was. But there was something in his eyes, a sadness, perhaps, that gave depth to his handsome features. "I'll be direct, Ms. Bloom," he said, sliding the water toward her. "After our unconventional meeting, I had my assistant look into your background. Your work at the Hamilton Arts Foundation was impressive. Your former boss spoke very highly of your organizational skills and attention to detail." Tessa blinked in surprise. "You called my references?" "I did." He leaned back in his chair. "I've been looking for someone to organize my company's archives for some time. Blueprints, correspondence, material samples, the history of Rowe Designs. It's become so important to me recently to preserve that history." "And you think I'm qualified for that?" "Your background suggests you are, but more importantly—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I believe you would respect the work. That matters to me." Tessa sipped her water, trying to gather her thoughts. "I have to ask, is this offer related to how you found me? Because if this is charity—" "It's not," he interrupted firmly. "This is a legitimate position with a competitive salary. The fact that we met under unusual circumstances doesn't change the fact that I need someone with your skills." She wasn't entirely convinced, but the mention of a competitive salary made her hesitate. What exactly would the job entail? "You'd be organizing our company archives, creating a digital catalog, and preserving physical materials properly. You'd have your own office here, though some of the work would take place at my home where many of the older materials are currently stored." At the mention of his home, Tessa felt her face flush again. "Your home? You mean—" "Yes, the house. Where we met," he confirmed. "I've converted one of the rooms into a temporary storage space for some of our more delicate archival materials." Tessa took another sip of water, weighing her options. The job sounded perfect for her. Organized, detail-oriented work that would utilize her skills. But the idea of returning to that house, of working closely with this man who had seen her at such a vulnerable moment. "What's the salary?" she asked finally. He named a figure that made her eyes widen. It was nearly twice what she'd made at the foundation. "That's generous," she managed. "It's what the position is worth," he replied evenly. "So, Ms. Bloom, are you interested?" Despite her lingering suspicions about his motives, Tessa couldn't afford to turn down such an opportunity. With her eviction looming and her savings dwindling, This job was a lifeline, yes, she said. I'm interested. For the first time, Beckett smiled, a small reserved thing that nevertheless transformed his face. Good. Claire will handle the paperwork. You can start tomorrow. The next morning, Tessa arrived at Rowe Designs to find Claire waiting with a stack of documents and a company laptop. Mr. Rowe thought you might want to familiarize yourself with our filing system before heading out to the house, Claire explained, leading her to a small but well-appointed office. He'll meet you there this afternoon to show you the archives. As Claire turned to leave, Tessa called after her, Claire, can I ask you something? The older woman paused. Of course. How long have you worked for Mr. Rowe? Since he started the company 8 years ago. Why do you ask? Tessa hesitated. He seems, I don't know, sad, maybe? Claire's professional demeanor softened slightly. Mr. Rowe has been through a great deal. It's not my place to share his personal history, but... She paused, as if deciding how much to say. That house means more to him than you might think. The fact that he's letting someone else in there is significant. With that cryptic statement, Claire left, closing the door behind her. Tessa spent the morning familiarizing herself with the company's digital archives, impressed by the attention to detail, but noticing several areas where the organization could be improved. By early afternoon, she felt prepared to see the physical archives. Following the directions Claire had given her, she drove back to the estate, feeling a flutter of nervousness as she turned onto the now familiar private drive. This time, Beckett's car was already parked outside. She knocked on the front door, which opened almost immediately. Beckett stood there in casual clothes, jeans and a grey t-shirt that made him look younger, less like the intimidating CEO she'd met yesterday. Ms. Bloom, he greeted her. Come in. Please, call me Tessa, she said, stepping inside and automatically removing her shoes. She noticed him watching the gesture with a hint of that same softness she'd glimpsed when he found her sleeping. Tessa, he repeated. Then you should call me Beckett. He led her through the house to a room she hadn't seen during her previous visit, a large study with windows overlooking a small pond. The room was filled with flat file cabinets, shelves of binders, and several large tubes that she assumed contained rolled blueprints. This is it, he said, gesturing to the organized chaos. 10 years of Rowe Designs history, some of it's catalogued, but most of it... He trailed off with a slight shrug. Tessa walked around the room, examining labels, opening drawers to peek at their contents. This is going to be a big job, she observed. Too big. There was a challenge in his voice. She smiled, feeling on firmer ground now that she was looking at a task she knew she could handle. No. Just right, actually, she continued. Her exploration, making mental notes about how she would approach the organization. When she turned back to Beckett, she found him watching her with an intensity that made her pause. Is something wrong? She asked. He seemed to catch himself and looked away. No, it's just... You look at home here. The comment hung in the air, between them, loaded with meaning neither of them was ready to address. Tessa cleared her throat. So, where should I start? Beckett moved to a shelf and pulled down a leather-bound portfolio. These are some of my earliest sketches. They're not labeled or dated properly. Maybe you could begin there. She took the portfolio, careful not to touch his fingers as they exchanged the item. I'll need a work surface. There's a desk by the window, he said, nodding to an antique desk she hadn't noticed before. Will that work? It's perfect. As she settled at the desk and began examining the contents of the portfolio, Beckett lingered by the door. I have some calls to make. Will you be all right on your own? Yes, of course, she assured him, already absorbed in the task. He nodded and left, closing the door quietly behind him. Alone in the study, Tessa opened the portfolio to find dozens of hand-drawn sketches, buildings, interior spaces, and detailed elements like staircases and window designs. The work was beautiful, showing not just technical skill, but a deep understanding of how spaces affected the people within them. She became so engrossed in organizing and examining the sketches that she lost track of time. The sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the desk, when a knock at the door startled her. Beckett entered carrying a tray with 2 mugs and a plate of cookies. I thought you might need a break, he said, setting the tray on a clear corner of the desk. "Thank you," Tessa said, suddenly aware of how stiff her shoulders had become. She reached for one of the mugs. Tea, not coffee, she noted with surprise. "How did you know I prefer tea?" she asked. A hint of color touched his cheeks. "I didn't. I just guessed." She took a sip, finding it perfectly sweetened. Another lucky guess, or had he been more thorough in his research than he'd admitted? "These sketches are amazing," she said, changing the subject. "You have a real gift." "Thank you." He picked up one of the drawings she'd set aside, a cozy reading nook with built-in bookshelves. "This was one of my first designs that actually got built, a library in Boston. It's beautiful, it feels inviting." She hesitated, then added, "All your work feels that way, like you're not just designing buildings, but places where people can feel at home." Something flickered in his eyes, pain perhaps, or memory. "That's always been the goal," he said softly. "What good is beautiful architecture if no one feels they belong in it?" They sat in companionable silence for a moment, sipping their tea. Tessa found herself studying his face, the strong line of his jaw, the slight furrow between his brows that suggested he frowned more often than he smiled. "Why did you decide to sell this house?" she asked suddenly. "It's clearly special to you." Beckett set down his mug, his expression closing off. "It's complicated. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have asked." "No, it's a fair question." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the pond. "I built this house for someone. She never got to live in it." The simple statement contained worlds of pain. Tessa felt her heart constrict. "I'm sorry," she said again, meaning it. He turned back to her, his face composed once more. "How are you finding the work so far?" She accepted the change of subject. "It's fascinating. I've already found a logical system for organizing the sketches, by project and date. Tomorrow I can start on the correspondence if you'd like." "That would be good." He hesitated, then added, "Some of those letters are personal. I trust you'll be discreet." "Of course," she assured him. "Confidentiality was a big part of my job at the foundation." He nodded, seemingly satisfied. "I should let you get back to work. Will you be much longer today?" Tessa checked her watch, surprised to see it was already past 5. "I should probably head home soon. I've made good progress for a first day." "I'll show you out when you're ready." She gathered her things and followed him through the house to the front door. At the threshold, he paused. "Thank you for today, Tessa. It's good to have someone caring for these things properly." The genuine gratitude in his voice touched her. "You're welcome, Beckett. I'll see you tomorrow. Actually, I'll be in meetings all day. Claire will let you in, and you can work at your own pace. The house is, well, you're welcome to make yourself comfortable." As she drove away, Tessa found herself thinking about the man she'd just left. His kindness mixed with reserve, the pain he clearly carried, and the beautiful home he'd built for someone who never lived in it. Despite her initial embarrassment and suspicions, she found herself looking forward to returning tomorrow, to learning more about Beckett Rowe through the pieces of his life's work he'd entrusted to her care. Beckett stood at the window, watching Tessa's car disappear down the driveway. Having her in the house had been both more difficult and easier than he'd expected. Difficult because her presence brought back memories of all the plans he'd made for this place, plans that included a life shared, not a life alone. Easier because somehow her quiet efficiency and genuine appreciation for his work had made the house feel less like a mausoleum and more like the home it was meant to be. He wandered back to the study, looking at the neat stacks she'd created from the chaos of his old sketches. She'd worked with care, respecting the materials without treating them as fragile relics. It was exactly the approach he'd hoped for when he'd impulsively decided to offer her the position. That first moment, finding her asleep in what should have been his and Eliza's bedroom, had jolted him out of the grief he'd been nursing for too long. Something about her peaceful presence in that space had touched a place in him he thought had died with Eliza. His phone buzzed with a text from Claire. "How did it go with the new archivist?" "Fine," he texted back. "She's good at what she does." Claire's response came quickly. "Are you sure this is wise, having her work at the house?" Was it wise? Probably not. But for the first time in 2 years, He'd walked through the house without feeling the crushing weight of absence in every room. Instead, he'd found himself noticing how the late afternoon light made Tessa's brown hair glow with golden highlights, how her small hands moved with precision as she sorted through his sketches, how she hummed softly to herself when she was concentrating. "I'm sure," he texted back and put his phone away. He moved to the desk where she'd been working and picked up one of his old sketches, an early concept drawing for this very house. He remembered drawing it in the hospital, sitting beside Eliza's bed as she slept, planning the life they would have together once she recovered. A life that never came to be. For 2 years he'd kept the house exactly as he'd designed it, a shrine to what might have been. But today, watching Tessa work in the study, he'd found himself wondering what changes she might make if the space were hers, where she might place a chair, what books would fill the shelves, what color she might paint the walls. The thought should have felt like a betrayal. Instead, it felt like waking up. He carefully returned the sketch to the pile she'd organized and left the study, closing the door behind him. Tomorrow he would be in meetings all day, but the day after he would return. And for the first time since Eliza's death, he found himself looking forward to coming back to this house, not for the memories it held, but for the future it might still contain. Over the next 2 weeks, Tessa fell into a comfortable routine. 3 days a week, she worked at the Row Designs office, organizing digital files and meeting with department heads to understand the company's workflow. The other 2 days, she worked at Beckett's house, slowly bringing order to the physical archives. She had expected to see little of Beckett himself, assuming a CEO would be too busy for daily check-ins. Instead, he made a point of stopping by whenever she was at the house, bringing her tea or asking about her progress. Their conversations, initially brief and professional, gradually lengthened and became more personal. On this particular Friday, Tessa had been working in the study for hours, sorting through correspondence related to one of Beckett's earliest major projects, a community arts center in Chicago. The letters revealed a side of him she hadn't seen before, passionate, idealistic, willing to fight for his vision even when clients pushed back. "How's it going?" She looked up to find Beckett leaning against the doorframe, 2 mugs in hand. He'd taken to bringing her tea at exactly 3 o'clock each day, a small ritual that she found herself looking forward to more than she wanted to admit. "Good," she said, accepting the mug he offered. "I'm learning a lot about you from these letters." He raised an eyebrow as he sat in the chair opposite her desk. "Should I be worried?" "Not at all. I'm impressed, actually. You really went to bat." "For that rooftop garden at the Chicago Arts Center," a smile touched his lips. "That garden was worth fighting for. It's still one of my favorite spaces we've designed." "Why?" she asked, genuinely curious. He considered the question, taking a sip of his tea before answering. "Because it wasn't just beautiful, it was useful. It became a community gathering, place somewhere people could feel connected to each other and to something growing and alive." He paused. "Architecture isn't just about creating pretty buildings. It's about creating spaces where life happens." The passion in his voice stirred. "Something in Tessa. I'd love to see it someday. Maybe you will," he said, and the possibility hung in the air between them. She turned back to the letters, trying to maintain her professional composure. "I found something interesting," she said, holding up a faded sketch on yellow paper. "This was tucked into one of the folders. It doesn't look like your work." Beckett took the sketch, his expression softening as he looked at it. "It's not. This was drawn by a 10-year-old boy who visited the construction site with his school. He sent it to me afterward, his vision for what the building should look like." "Did you write back?" "I did better than that. I incorporated this element here," he pointed to a curved entryway the child had drawn, "into the final design. Then I invited him to the opening ceremony and showed him how his idea had become part of the building." Tessa smiled, touched by the story. "That was kind of you." He shrugged, but she could tell the memory meant something to him. "It was a good idea. Age doesn't matter when it comes to good design." As he handed the sketch back to her, their fingers brushed briefly. The small contact sent a surprising jolt through Tessa, and she quickly looked down, hoping he hadn't noticed her reaction. "I have to head back to the office for a late meeting," he said, standing. "Will you be all right here for a couple more?" Hours? You're welcome to stay as long as you need. I'll be fine, she assured him. I want to finish organizing this project before I leave today. He nodded and headed for the door, then paused. I was thinking, tomorrow is Saturday. If you're not busy, maybe you could come by anyway. There's a box of personal correspondence I've been meaning to go through. It might be easier if you're here to help organize as we sort. Personal correspondence? Letters to and from Eliza, he said quietly. My fiancée. It was the first time he'd mentioned her name, though Claire had eventually told Tessa the basics, that Beckett had been engaged, that his fiancée had died from cancer before they could marry, and that the house had been designed for their life together. Are you sure you want me to be part of that? She asked carefully. It seems very private. I'm sure, he said. I've been putting it off for too long. Having you here might make it easier. He offered a small smile. Besides, who better to help than a professional archivist? After he left, Tessa sat holding her tea thinking about his invitation. It represented a level of trust she hadn't expected. Beckett Rowe, who by all accounts kept his private life fiercely private, was inviting her into one of his most intimate spaces, his memories of the woman he had loved and lost. She couldn't deny that she was curious about Eliza, about the woman who had inspired such devotion. But more than that, she was touched that Beckett trusted her enough to share this part of himself. The next morning, Tessa arrived at the house to find Beckett, waiting on the front porch with 2 cups of coffee from a local cafe. I wasn't sure how you take your coffee, he said, handing her one of the cups, so I got cream and sugar packets just in case. Black is perfect, actually, she said, pleasantly surprised. Thank you. They walked together into the house, and Tessa noticed small changes since she'd been there the day before. Fresh flowers in a vase on the entry table, a throw blanket casually draped over the living room couch. Small touches that made the perfectly designed space feel more lived in. Have you been staying here? She asked, following him up the stairs. A few nights this week, he admitted. It seems silly to keep avoiding the place when I'm here so often for our work together. They passed the master bedroom, the room where she'd fallen asleep that first day, and continued down the hall to a smaller room she hadn't seen before. Unlike the rest of the house, this space felt untouched, preserved. A woman's silk robe hung on a hook by the door. Framed photos covered one wall. And in the center of the room sat a large wooden chest. This was going to be Eliza's studio, Beckett explained, his voice soft. She was an artist, watercolors mostly. I designed this room specifically for the northern light. Tessa stood quietly, taking in the space and what it represented. A life planned but never lived. Dreams carefully designed but never realized. Beckett moved to the chest and ran his hand over the polished wood. All her letters are in here. Cards, notes, sketches we sent back and forth when we were planning the house. He took a deep breath. I haven't opened it since I put everything inside after the funeral. The vulnerability in his voice touched Tessa deeply. We don't have to do this today if you're not ready. If not now, then when, he said, more to himself than to her. With a decisive motion, he lifted the lid of the chest. Inside were bundles of letters tied with ribbons, greeting cards in envelopes, notebooks, and loose pages of sketches. A life documented in paper and ink. They sat on the floor beside the chest, and Beckett began to remove items one by one, telling stories as they worked. He showed her the first card Eliza had given him, a handmade watercolor of the coffee shop where they'd met. He read snippets from letters they'd exchanged during a period when his work had taken him to Japan for 3 months, and he showed her the preliminary sketches they'd made together for the house, her artistic vision guiding his architectural expertise. She had strong opinions about the design, he said with a soft laugh, showing Tessa a sketch where Eliza had crossed out one of his ideas and replaced it with her own. We argued for weeks about whether the kitchen should open to the dining room or the living room. Who won? Tessa asked. She did, of course, and she was right. He looked at Tessa, his eyes warm with memory. The kitchen opens to the living room, so whoever's cooking isn't isolated from the conversation. Tessa had noticed that feature of the house, how the spaces flowed naturally into one another, creating a sense of connection even between separate rooms. It was one of the things she loved about the design. As the morning progressed, Beckett began to relax, sharing stories and memories more freely. Tessa sorted the materials as they went, creating a system that preserved the chronology of the relationship while protecting the more delicate items. Around noon, they broke for lunch, which Beckett had prepared and left in the refrigerator. Simple sandwiches and a salad they ate on the patio, overlooking the garden. "Tell me about your life before we met," Beckett said as they ate. "You mentioned you have no family." Tessa nodded, setting down her sandwich. "My mother died when I was 12. Cancer, like your Eliza. My father, well, he checked out emotionally. After that, he was physically present but not really there, if that makes sense. He died my senior year of college. Heart attack." "I'm sorry," Beckett said quietly. "That must have been lonely." "It was," she admitted, "but I've always been good at taking care of myself. And I had my work at the foundation, which I loved." She smiled ruefully, "until it closed without warning and left me unemployed." "Their loss is my gain," Beckett said, then looked slightly embarrassed at his own words. "I mean, Row Designs' gain. You're doing excellent work with the archives." "Thank you," she said, touched by the compliment. "It means a lot to hear that." After lunch, they returned to Eliza's studio to continue their work. As the afternoon wore on, Tessa found herself drawn deeper into the story of Beckett and Eliza, their love, their plans, their shared vision for the future. Through Eliza's letters, a picture emerged of a vibrant, passionate woman who had loved Beckett deeply and understood him in a way few people did. "She sounds amazing," Tessa said, as she carefully placed a watercolor sketch of the house into an archival sleeve. "She was," Beckett agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "She would have loved this house. Every detail was planned with her in mind." He looked around the studio, his expression a mixture of grief and gratitude. "Thank you for doing this with me. I couldn't have faced it alone." "I'm glad I could help," Tessa said sincerely. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the floor, they finished organizing the last of the letters. Beckett closed the chest, running his hand over the wood one more time before standing. "Would you stay for dinner?" he asked suddenly. "I could cook, or we could order something." The invitation surprised her, but Tessa found herself nodding before she could overthink it. "I'd like that, but let me cook. You've had an emotionally exhausting day." He smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "Deal. The kitchen is yours." In the kitchen, Tessa moved with comfortable familiarity, having spent enough time in the house to know where things were kept. She prepared a simple pasta dish while Beckett opened a bottle of wine and set the table. "You seem at home here," he observed, watching her work. The comment made her pause. She had felt at home, moving through his kitchen as if it were her own. The realization unsettled her. This wasn't her home. This was a house built for another woman, a house filled with memories and plans that had nothing to do with her. "I'm sorry," Beckett said, noticing her change in demeanor. "Did I say something wrong?" Tessa shook her head, forcing a smile. "No, not at all. I just realized I've gotten very comfortable here. I should probably remember I'm just a temporary visitor." Something flickered in his eyes. Disappointment, perhaps. "Is that how you see yourself, as a visitor?" "Isn't that what I am?" she countered gently. "This house, it has a history, a purpose, and I'm not part of that story." Beckett sat down, his wineglass, and moved closer to her. "Maybe the story isn't finished yet." The intensity in his gaze made her heart race. For a moment, she thought he might reach for her, and she wasn't sure if she wanted him to or not. But the moment passed, and he stepped back, giving her space. They ate dinner at the kitchen island, the conversation carefully returning to safer topics, her progress with the archives, his upcoming projects at work. But something had shifted. Between them, an acknowledgement of feelings neither of them was ready to name. After dinner, as Tessa prepared to leave, Beckett walked her to the door. "Thank you again for today," he said, "not just for helping with the letters, but for listening, for understanding." "Anytime," she said, meaning it. He hesitated, then added, "I have to go out of town next week. A project in Seattle needs my attention. Will you be all right working here on your own?" Of course, I've got plenty to keep me busy. Good. He seemed reluctant to end the evening. I've left a key for you on the desk in the study. You can come and go as you need to. The gesture of trust touched her. I'll take good care of everything. I know you will. He smiled, and she was struck again by how it transformed his face, erasing the lines of grief that had become so familiar. Good night, Tessa. Good night, Beckett. The week that followed was strange for Tessa. Without Beckett's daily visits to the study, the house felt both emptier and more intimate. She found herself lingering in different rooms, imagining what life would be like if this were truly her home. In the kitchen, she'd run her hand along the marble countertops, thinking of meals she might prepare. In the living room, she'd curl, up in the window seat with a cup of tea, watching the rain that fell steadily for 2 days. And in the master bedroom, which she'd avoided until now, she found herself standing in the doorway, remembering that first day when exhaustion had overcome her propriety, and she'd fallen asleep in a stranger's bed. It wasn't a stranger's bed anymore. Now it was Beckett's bed, and that thought brought with it a flood of complicated feelings she wasn't ready to examine. On Thursday afternoon, as she was organizing a collection of material samples in the study, her phone rang. Beckett's name flashed on the screen. "Hello," she answered, surprised by how happy she was to hear from him. "Tessa," his voice came through, warm despite the distance. "How are things going there?" "Good. I've made a lot of progress with the material samples, and I found those missing blueprints for the San Francisco project. They were misfiled with some personal papers." "That's great," he said, "but I wasn't actually calling about work." "Oh?" She set down the fabric swatch she'd been labeling. "I wanted to see how you're doing, if the house is treating you well." The personification made her smile. "The house and I are getting along just fine, though it's quieter without you here." "I miss our tea breaks," he admitted, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Me too." She hesitated, then asked, "How's Seattle?" "Rainy. Productive. We're finalizing the design for a new library." He paused. "I found myself sketching elements you might like. A reading nook similar to the one you admired in my early drawings." The thought that he was thinking of her even while working on a major project sent a warm flutter through her chest. "I'm flattered. It's easy to design spaces when you have someone specific in mind," he said softly. The words hung between them, loaded with meaning. Tessa thought of Eliza, of the house designed with her in mind, and felt a pang of something like guilt. "When do you come back?" she asked, changing the subject. "Saturday night. I was thinking—" He hesitated. "Would you like to have dinner on Sunday?" "Not at the house. Somewhere else. Just the two of us." "Like a date?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. "Yes," he said simply. "Like a date." Tessa's heart raced. This was the moment to draw a clear line, to keep their relationship professional, but the truth was she didn't want to. Over these weeks of working together, of sharing tea and conversations, of learning about his past and opening up about her own, she had developed feelings for Beckett that went far beyond the professional. "I'd like that," she said finally. "Good." The relief in his voice was palpable. "I'll pick you up at 7. And Tessa?" "Yes?" "Thank you for bringing life back into this house. Into my life." After they hung up, Tessa sat for a long time, thinking about his words. She had come to this house by accident, drawn by its warmth and beauty, seeking a temporary escape from her own problems. She never expected to find a place that felt so right, or a man whose broken heart somehow complemented her own loneliness. But as she looked around the study, at the evidence of a life built around another woman, she couldn't help but wonder, was there truly room for her here? Or was she just a temporary caretaker for someone else's dream? Beckett stood at the window of his Seattle hotel room, phone still in hand, looking out at the rain-slicked city below. The call to Tessa had left him feeling lighter than he had in years, despite the weight of the decision he'd just made. Asking her to dinner, making it clear it was a date, was a step he'd been contemplating since that day they'd sorted through Eliza's letters together. Watching Tessa handle those precious memories with such care and respect had touched him deeply. She hadn't tried to erase Eliza from his life. Instead, she'd helped him preserve those memories properly, giving him a way to honor the past without being trapped in it. His phone buzzed with a text from Claire. The realtor called again. "Are you still planning to sell the house?" Beckett stared at the message for a long moment before typing his reply. "No, take it off the market." The decision felt right. The house that had once been a monument to loss was slowly becoming something else. A place of possibility, of new beginnings. And that transformation had everything to do with the woman who had fallen asleep in his bed on a spring afternoon, and somehow awakened something in him he thought had died with Eliza. He turned back to his desk, where sketches for the Seattle library lay spread out. Among the official designs were smaller, personal sketches, a reading nook with a window seat, a garden path leading to a secluded bench, a kitchen that opened to a living room where conversation could flow freely. Spaces designed with Tessa in mind, just as the house had once been designed for Eliza, but therein lay his fear. Was it fair to bring Tessa into a home built for another woman? Could he truly offer her a future that wasn't shadowed by his past? Sundays. Dinner would be a beginning, a chance to see if what was growing between them could flourish outside the confines of the house and their professional relationship. A chance to see if the feeling of rightness he experienced whenever she was near was something they could build a future on. He picked up his pencil and began to sketch again, not a building this time, but a garden. The garden behind the house, reimagined with new plantings, a different path, a small studio where Tessa might work on rainy days. A space that honored what had been but made room for what could be. As the rain tapped against the window, Beckett allowed himself, for the first time in 2 years, to hope. Sunday evening arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze. Tessa stood in front of her apartment mirror, smoothing the fabric of her simple blue dress, the nicest one she owned, and coincidentally the same one she'd worn the day she'd first visited Beckett's house. The past few days had been a whirlwind of emotions. After Beckett's call, she'd thrown herself into her work at the house, trying to sort through her feelings as methodically as she organized his archives. But her heart wasn't as easily catalogued as blueprints and letters. At precisely 7 o'clock, there was a knock at her door. When she opened it, she found Beckett standing there in a charcoal grey suit that fit him perfectly, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. "You look beautiful," he said, his eyes taking her in with an appreciation that made her cheeks warm. "Thank you." She accepted the flowers, touched by the gesture. "These are lovely. They reminded me of you, simple but beautiful." He looked around her small apartment, taking in the neatly organized bookshelves and the framed prints on the walls. "Your place is nice." "It's small," she said, feeling suddenly self-conscious about her modest home compared to his estate. "But it's been good to me." "It feels like you," he said, and his genuine appreciation eased her discomfort. "Ready to go?" The restaurant he'd chosen was an intimate Italian place overlooking a small lake. Their table by the window offered a view of the sunset reflecting on the water, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. "This is beautiful," Tessa said as they were seated. "I thought you'd like it." Beckett seemed slightly nervous, his usual confidence tempered by a vulnerability she found endearing. "I haven't done this in a while, taken someone to dinner." "Not like this. I haven't either," she admitted. "It's been a long time since I've dated anyone." "Why is that?" he asked, genuinely curious. She considered the question as the waiter poured their wine. "I guess I've been focused on work, and maybe a little afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Of letting someone in, of building something that could be taken away." She traced the rim of her wineglass with her finger. "After my parents, I learned how quickly you can lose the people you care about." Understanding filled his eyes. "I know something about that." They fell into easy conversation as they ordered and ate, discussing books they loved, places they'd traveled, dreams they'd had as children. It was different from their conversations at the house, less guarded, more personal. Tessa found herself laughing more than she had in months, drawn in by Beckett's dry wit and thoughtful observations. "Can I ask you something?" she said, as they shared a tiramisu for dessert. "Why did you decide to sell the house after putting so much of yourself into it?" Beckett set down his fork, his expression growing serious. After Eliza died, the house became a monument to what we'd lost. Every room, every detail was designed for a life we would never have. He looked out at the darkening lake. For 2 years, I couldn't bear to live there. Couldn't bear to let anyone else live there either. It was frozen in time, a beautiful museum of grief. What changed? She asked softly. His eyes met hers. You fell asleep in my bed. The simple statement hung between them, laden with meaning. Finding you there, he continued, so peaceful, so naturally at home in a space that had only ever been filled with absence. It woke something in me, made me see the house not as a tomb for dead dreams, but as a place where life could still happen. Tessa's heart raced at his words. Is that why you offered me the job? Because I fell asleep in your house? Partly, he admitted, but also because when I looked into your background, I found someone who cared deeply about preserving history, while making it accessible to the present. Someone who could help me do the same with my own past. And has it worked? She asked. Have I helped? He reached across the table and took her hand. More than you know. The touch of his fingers against hers sent warmth spreading up her arm. Beckett, let's walk, he suggested, gently interrupting what she had been about to confess. There's a path around the lake. Outside, the night air was cool but pleasant. They walked close together, their hands occasionally brushing until Beckett gently took hers in his. The simple contact felt right, as if their hands had been designed to fit together. I took the house off the market, he said as they paused to look out over the water. You did? When? From Seattle, after I called you. He turned to face her, still holding her hand. I realized I didn't want to let it go, but not for the reasons. I'd been holding on to it before. What do you mean? His eyes were intense in the moonlight. For 2 years I kept the house as a shrine to what I'd lost. Now I want to keep it as a home for what I might find. The weight of his words settled around them. Tessa felt both exhilarated and terrified by what he seemed to be suggesting. Beckett, she said carefully, I care about you. These past weeks have been incredible. But I need to know, am I stepping into a ghost story? Am I competing with a memory? He was quiet for a moment, considering her question with the seriousness it deserved. When Eliza died, I thought I'd never love again. The pain was too great, the loss too complete. He squeezed her hand gently. What I felt for her will always be part of me, but it's not a competition, Tessa. The heart doesn't work that way. Then how does it work? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It expands, he said simply. It makes room. He lifted his free hand to her cheek, his touch feather-light. I'm not asking you to replace her or compete with her memory. I'm asking if you might be willing to build something new with me, something that honors the past, without being imprisoned by it. Tessa leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. When she opened them, she saw nothing but sincerity and hope in his gaze. I'd like that, she said softly. But I'm scared, Beckett. I've never felt at home anywhere the way I do in your house, and that terrifies me because it's not my home. It was designed for someone else. Then let's redesign it, he said, his voice growing more confident. Together. Keep what works, change what doesn't. Make it ours, not just mine or hers. The sigh, word ours, hung in the air between them, full of promise and possibility. Before she could respond, he leaned down and kissed her, gently at first, then with growing confidence as she responded. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer, and she wound her arms around his neck, giving herself over to the feeling of rightness that had been building since that first day. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Beckett rested his forehead against hers. I'm falling in love with you, Tessa Bloom, and it doesn't feel like replacing what I lost. It feels like finding something I didn't know I was looking for. Tears pricked at her eyes. I'm falling in love with you too, she whispered, and it scares me how right it feels. He kissed her again, briefly but tenderly. Let's be scared together then. They walked back to the car hand in hand, the night wrapping around them like a promise. As Beckett drove her home, Tessa found herself thinking not of the past or even the future, but of the present moment, the warmth of his hand in hers, the shared silence that felt comfortable rather than awkward, the sense that something important had shifted in her world. At her apartment door, he kissed her goodnight, lingering, as if reluctant to leave. "Have dinner with me tomorrow," he asked. "At the house. I want to cook for you." "I'd like that," she said, smiling up at him. After he left, Tessa moved through her apartment with a strange mix of emotions. Joy at what was beginning between them, but also a nagging fear that she was stepping into a story that wasn't truly hers. Would she always feel like a visitor in a house built for another woman? Could they really create something new together, without being shadowed by the past? The next day at work, Tessa found it hard to concentrate. Her mind kept returning to the previous night. Beckett's words, his kiss, the way he'd looked at her in the moonlight. Claire noticed her distraction, stopping by her office around noon with a knowing look. "So how was dinner?" the older woman asked, leaning against the doorframe. Tessa blushed. "It was nice. Just nice." Claire raised an eyebrow. "Beckett came in this morning looking happier than I've seen him in 2 years. And all you can say is, nice." "It was wonderful," Tessa admitted, unable to keep the smile from her face. "He's wonderful." Claire's expression softened. "He is, and he deserves to be happy again." She hesitated, then added, "So do you, Tessa." "Thank you, Claire." After Claire left, Tessa tried to return to her work, but found herself staring at the clock, counting the hours until she could leave for Beckett's house, their dinner date. The thought sent a flutter of butterflies through her stomach. When she arrived at the house that evening, she found Beckett in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, cooking something that filled the space with delicious aromas. "Something smells amazing," she said, setting down her purse on the counter. He looked up with a smile that made her heart skip. "My grandmother's lasagna recipe. One of the few things I know how to cook well." He leaned over to kiss her cheek. "Wine, please." As he poured her a glass, Tessa was struck by how different the house felt tonight. Not just a beautiful architectural achievement, not just a repository of memories, but a living space filled with warmth and possibility. "I've been thinking," Beckett said as he handed her the wine, "about what you said last night, about the house being designed for someone else." "Oh?" She took a sip of wine, trying to calm her suddenly racing heart. "You were right. Every inch of this place was designed with Eliza in mind." He leaned back against the counter, his eyes serious. "But a house isn't just its design, Tessa. It's the life that happens inside it." He took her hand and led her through to the living room, where she noticed something different. A small wooden box on the coffee table. "What's that?" she asked. "Open it," he encouraged. Inside the box she found a key, simple, silver, unadorned. "It's yours," he said quietly. "Not just to come and go for work, but to be here, whenever you want, however you want." She picked up the key, feeling its weight in her palm. "Beckett, I'm not asking you to move in," he clarified quickly. "Not yet, that would be too soon for both of us. I'm just saying that this house, it has rooms that were designed for someone else, yes, but they're empty rooms, Tessa. Waiting to be filled with new memories." He took both her hands in his. "I want you to feel free to make changes, move furniture, bring your things, paint a wall if you want to, make your mark here, so it's not just my house or the house I built for Eliza, but a place where you belong too." Tears welled in her eyes at the generosity of his offer, not just the key to his home, but permission to help reshape it into something that could be theirs. "Thank you," she whispered, closing her fingers around the key. "That means more than you know." He kissed her then, gentle but sure, and she felt the last of her doubts begin to dissolve. This wasn't about replacing what he had lost, but about building something new together, honoring the past while creating a future neither of them had expected to find. Dinner was perfect, the food delicious, the conversation easy and intimate. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories from their childhoods, discussing books and movies, dreaming aloud about places they might visit together. After they'd cleared the dishes, Beckett took her hand again. "There's something else I want to show you." He led her upstairs, not to the master bedroom as she half expected, but to a different room, one she hadn't seen before. It was at the back of the house with windows that looked out over the garden and pond beyond. This was going to be a guest room, he explained, opening the door. But I never finished it. The room was empty except for a desk positioned in front of the window and a comfortable-looking chair. On the desk sat a small potted plant and a framed photograph that she recognized as one from her office, a picture of her as a child with her mother in a garden. How did you... Claire helped, he admitted. I thought, if you wanted, this could be your space. For work, for reading, for whatever you need. A room that was never designed for anyone but you. Tessa walked slowly into the room, taking in the perfect light, the view of the garden, the thoughtful positioning of the desk. It's beautiful, she said, her voice thick with emotion. It's just a start, he said, standing in the doorway. We can add whatever you want, bookshelves, a daybed, different curtains. She turned to face him, overwhelmed by the gesture. You're really serious about this, aren't you? About us making this house ours together? I am. He stepped into the room, taking her hands once more. Tessa, when you walked into this house that first day, something changed. You brought life back into a place that had been frozen in grief. You saw beauty here when all I could see was loss. He drew her closer. I don't know exactly what the future holds for us. I just know that when I imagine my future now, you're in it. And this house isn't a monument anymore, it's a home I want to share with you, in whatever way makes sense for us. Tessa's heart felt full to bursting. The fear that had lingered, that she was just a temporary visitor in someone else's story, finally dissolved completely. Beckett wasn't asking her to step into a role that had been written for someone else. He was asking her to write a new story with him, one that acknowledged the past without being defined by it. I want that too, she said, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her head against his chest. She could hear his heart beating, strong and steady. To build something new with you, to make this house a home, our home. He tipped her chin up gently, his eyes searching hers. Does that mean you'll stay tonight? The question was loaded with meaning, not just about this night, but about many nights to come, about beginnings and possibilities and trust. Yes, she said simply. I'll stay. His kiss was both tender and passionate, a promise of all they could be together. When they parted, his smile lit up his entire face. You're already home, Tessa. You have been since that first day. We both are, she whispered, and knew it was true. 6 months later, Tessa stood in what was now officially her room, packing the last of her things from her apartment into boxes. After months of splitting, her time between her small apartment and Beckett's house, their house now, she had finally given notice to her landlord. Tomorrow she would officially move in. So much had changed in half a year. The house had gradually transformed, not dramatically, but in small, meaningful ways that made it truly theirs. Her books now filled shelves that had been empty. Quilt made by her grandmother lay across the foot of their bed. The kitchen contained her favorite mugs alongside Beckett's more elegant dishware. And more importantly, the rooms were filled with new memories, dinners with friends, quiet evenings reading together, morning coffee on the patio, passionate nights in what was now their bedroom. The door opened and Beckett walked in, carrying another empty box. Need any help? I think I'm almost done, she said, smiling at him. Just a few more books to pack. He set down the box and wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. Are you happy? He asked quietly. Tessa leaned back against him, savoring the solid warmth of his body. Happier than I ever thought possible, she answered truthfully. She turned in his arms to face him. At 33, Beckett looked younger than he had when they'd first met. The lines of grief around his eyes had softened, replaced by laugh lines that deepened when he smiled, which he did often now. I love you, she said, the words still new enough to send a thrill through her when she spoke them. I love you too. He kissed her forehead. More than I can say. That evening, after the last box had been packed and loaded into her car, they sat on the patio watching the sunset. The garden had changed too. Beckett had redesigned it with her input, creating a space that reflected both of their tastes. A small studio now stood near the pond, a place where Tessa worked on her own projects when she wasn't managing the now perfectly organized archives. "I have something for you," Beckett said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small velvet box. Tessa's heart leapt into her throat. "Beckett!" "It's not what you think," he said with a smile, opening the box to reveal not a ring but a small silver charm in the shape of a house. "Or at least, not yet. That will come when we're both ready." He took the charm out of the box. "This is for your bracelet," he explained, gesturing to the silver charm bracelet he'd given her for her birthday 2 months ago. "To commemorate tomorrow, the day you officially move in." Tears pricked at her eyes as she held out her wrist, allowing him to attach the charm to her bracelet. "It's perfect," she whispered. "I had it engraved," he said, turning the small silver house over to reveal tiny words etched on the back. Tessa squinted to read the minuscule text. "Already home." The words took her back to that first day, to waking up in a stranger's bed, mortified and afraid, only to find understanding instead of anger, kindness instead of judgment. To the journey that had brought them here, to this moment, to a love neither of them had been looking for but both had found. "We are, aren't we?" she said softly. "Already home." Beckett took her hand, his thumb brushing over the new charm. "From the moment you walked through that door." As the last light of day faded into dusk, they sat together in comfortable silence, watching as stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring change, the official beginning of their life together under one roof. But in all the ways that mattered, Tessa knew the truth of the words engraved on her charm. They were already home. They had been from the start, the end,